Hello everybody, and welcome to the sixth lecture now for our YouTube series. This one is entitled Seeds of the American Revolution. Awesome. Fireworks are always a cool thing. Just to warn you, this one's probably going to go a little bit longer than some of the other ones I've had. You have the whole week to watch this, because what I want to do is basically cover everything that leads up to the American Revolution. I'm taking what would normally have been maybe 3 different lectures and combining them into one major lecture here on YouTube. We'll discuss some of these things in greater detail in class as well, just so you're aware of that. All right, well, let's go and get started then. And we'll start with what is happening right after the French-Indian War has come to an end. You may remember we talked about this war in Europe known as the 7 Years' War, French-Indian War here in the colonial America. Great Britain winds up the victor, and they take a lot of land from the French, but unfortunately more than 75% of British revenue will disappear. It was a very, very costly war. Great Britain goes into debt in fighting this war. And they realize that, as any normal government would, that they've got to basically bring back this money that they've lost. The Treasury is nearly bankrupt. For all intents and purposes, we're going to use this expression Prime Minister, although really and truly the British didn't use that word quite yet. But let's, for sake of simplification, we're going to call this guy George Grenville the Prime Minister of England. From 1763 to 1765. And it's going to be his duty, as it were, to raise money to bring back the financial stability of his country. And he realizes he's going to have to raise taxes to do this. He's going to raise taxes in Great Britain. The British are going to have to pay more taxes. But he's also going to realize that America needs to do the same. In fact, I'm going to quote right from him in addressing Parliament. He said, it is just and necessary that a revenue be raised in America for defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the colonies. So in other words, they sent armies over here to protect the colonies. Costs a lot of money. So he's saying basically that it's only right and fair that the Americans now pay their fair share. And if you really stop to think about it, he's right. Of course, Americans really won't quite see it this way, and I guess it's in the way that the British go about doing this. The colonists are going to have to help lift this burden. They're going to have to help pay their fair share of taxes. The first tax that's actually imposed on the Americans is known as the Sugar Act, 1764, a year after the French-Indian Wars come to an end. Now, it's a tax on molasses primarily, which, as you know, is derived from sugarcane. But it's also a tax on Madeira wine and coffee as well. But the biggest part of this was this 3 pence, or let's say 3 penny per gallon on molasses. Secretively, George Grenville hoped to raise at least 40,000, and I'm going to use the word dollars, even though it would actually be pounds. We would say 40,000 pounds. But, for us that might be confusing, so I'll say $40,000. He's hoping to at least raise $40,000 from this act, but he publicly is going to declare $100,000. He's hoping this is going to raise a lot of money to help pay for this war debt that they've incurred. And he's going to, remember the Navigation Acts. He's going to dust off these Navigation Acts, and he's going to declare that they're truly going to enforce them. He's declared war on smuggling. He's going to increase the amount of paperwork that a ship captain traveling throughout the colonies, and when I say the colonies, I mean from the colonies, the 13 colonies into the Caribbean and trade for sugar and turn into molasses. There's a lot of paperwork now that the captains have to fill out. A lot of enumerated products, again, that they have to account for. But it's also going to allow these navigation acts, it's going to allow British ships to stop any American ship that they want to go aboard and even seize the ship if they think that smuggling is taking place. Plus, under the navigation laws, if you're caught smuggling, you immediately go to the Vice Admiralty courts. And if you remember, these are the Navy courts where there are no juries. There are no juries at all. So they're going to start now really enforcing these navigation laws. But again, Americans are very, very good at smuggling. And throughout this time period, 90% of all molasses that you could find in the New England colonies, really it's going to come from trade with the French. They're going to continue the trade with the French Caribbean islands, predominantly Haiti, and they're going to find all kinds of ways to bribe, to smuggle, to sneak around British Navy, and continue to smuggle. They're just not going to do what they're being asked to do. Another part of Greenville's plan is to enforce what's known as a quartering act. Quartering is where you house soldiers. Normally you build barracks. The word barracks that's where soldiers actually will live, sleep, eat. But what if soldiers are on the march? What if they're in the colonies and have to march out to the western frontier to protect against Indian raids? Well, what do you do then? Well, you have to quarter these soldiers. First and foremost, they're to be quartered in what's known as public buildings. For instance, if there's a library in a town, or if there's a tavern, I don't know if you've ever heard of what's called a pub. Today, a lot of people talk about going to eat at a pub. That's short for public house. These were public houses that people could come and community and obviously drink beer, but also gossip on the latest news and things like that. Well, under a quartering act, soldiers would have to be quartered there as well. But what if you didn't have any public buildings? Well, the second step would be private homes. You'd have to quarter soldiers in your house. Think of where you live right now, and imagine if every bedroom in your house now, you had to put 5 or 6 soldiers in it. Your living room, your dining room, you had to put cots up. Where are you going to sleep? Where are you going to do the day-to-day things that you like to do in your own house? You could perhaps imagine why this is going to start to really annoy American colonists. The other thing was, under the Quartering Act, they had to supply the soldiers with certain items. One item was beer. Believe it or not, beer is a form of currency in this time period. And Americans start to brew beer in the colonies for this very purpose. Also, they had to create soap and candles for the soldiers. Now, the thing that really annoyed Americans is, for the most part, they actually already were doing this, but they were doing it on their own. Brewing beer for soldiers, making soap, making candles. But now there's this law that's telling them, oh, no, you have to do it. And this, again, annoys Americans a lot. Perhaps one of the most important laws that Greenville has passed against the colonies is what's known as the Currency Act. This is going to be something we're going to talk a lot about throughout our course of history. What actually is money? To you today, if I was to say, show me some money, show me the money, right? You would probably go and take out your wallet and you take out a $5 bill, a $10 bill. And I would say, that's nice. It is paper, though, right? What you're showing me is, in fact, paper, right? How did paper become real money, right? This is going to be an interesting thing that's going to occur. It's going to start here in America. Normally, in this time period, they're using gold coin or silver coin, what they call specie. It's the word they use is called specie for this. But in Virginia, during the French Indian War, they began to print paper currency. And paper is money by what's called an act of law. We call that fiat. And again, I'm going to explain a lot more of this in class, so don't worry if this is going over your head right now. But paper versus gold coin. As Virginia begins to print paper money, paper money begins to depreciate very, very rapidly because you have to back it up on something. And if you're saying fiat by law, you're backing up by nothing. It's just paper, and someone's telling you it's money. So immediately the British say no, 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 no to this. They are not at all going to allow this to happen. They're not happy at all.
No, God! No, God, please, no!
Yep.
No! No! No!
Yes, of course. Yeah. Even Michael from The Office understands that paper money is a terrible idea. So the British are going to pass the Currency Act, that you could only pay, for instance, custom duties when ships come into the various harbors, Boston Harbor, New York Harbor, Philadelphia, Charlestown, Savannah. You've got to use gold or silver coins. You may never, ever use paper money. They're going to stop the colonists from printing their own paper money, which in actuality is a smart thing to do, but the colonists won't see it this way. They'll be very angered again that there's not enough gold coin. The other thing is you're taking the gold coin that exists in the colonies and you're now paying the soldiers with it. And so the colonists begin to argue that our gold coin are going to leave. And in fact, this actually happens. Many of these soldiers will be transferred out to Canada. So a lot of that gold coin is going to leave the American colonies and wind up in Canada. And all of a sudden you have a gold and silver coin shortage happens. And this is why Americans want so bad to print paper money, something to kind of offset the loss of the gold currency. But the British won't allow it. And then we get to this dreaded thing known as the Stamp Act, 1765. And right over here, you see I have what this stamp would look like. It's an interesting concept. All paper goods, everything that was used, for instance, in business, marriage licenses, ship documents, any newspapers, actually writing letters, even playing cards, you had to buy the stamp for it. And dice as well. Dice was a big game at this time period. And they also included dice. Anything and everything that was paper, you were going to have to buy this stamp. And this was a tax that you were going to pay. Americans, this is what finally breaks the camel's back, right? The straw that breaks the camel's back. They felt this attacked them directly in their pocketbooks. They also felt it struck at direct local liberties of Americans. It took away their rights as Englishmen. All of a sudden, we have this argument over what are taxes. Internal tax, that's where the colonies tax themselves. And they were doing this. Colonies had been taxing themselves for a long time. And they would take a portion of that tax and send it to England. Well, now you have this external tax that came directly from Parliament. This is the first time in their history that Parliament will directly tax Americans. And this is what really angers them, that they had no say in this. Parliament simply passed the tax. Also, we're going to talk about later on in class what's a direct tax and an indirect tax. This stamp tax is also direct tax. You see it. When you went to go buy a newspaper, if you went to go buy playing cards, or you had to buy a marriage license or a business license, you had to directly pay for this tax, as opposed to an indirect tax, one that's already there and you just don't see it. An example for us today would be gasoline. When you guys go put gas in your car, you just fill it up at the pump. You don't notice that there's already built-in taxes in there. So that's an indirect tax. Colonists were very angry. They saw they could absolutely see this tax, and it was coming externally. It was coming from outside of their influence, directly from Great Britain. And this is going to anger Americans beyond belief. Just so you understand why they passed this tax. In order to feed and pay and house the Army, the Navy, and even to come up with what they called Indian gifts, it would cost the British government £400,000 or $400,000 every year. Where's that money going to come from? Parliament is already in debt because of the French Indian War. Again, they're hoping to raise at least a percentage of this, perhaps 25%, 30% of the costs will be directly associated to the Stamp Act, where the Americans will now help pay for these soldiers. And that was the whole key to the Stamp Act. You are helping to pay for an army that now has to be stationed in America to protect you from Indian attacks. It really kind of seems fair. Parliament also will argue that even though the Americans come up with their no taxation without representation propaganda slogan, well, Parliament will counter with that you have what's called virtual representation. And we're going to talk about that, I believe, on Tuesday in class. What exactly is virtual representation? Well, just to let you know, it's basically this idea. There is a government. It's called Parliament. The head of this government is the King of England, George III, and Parliament represents everybody in the British Empire by virtual representation. Even though you don't have a direct vote to this, you are still part of it. And this becomes this huge argument of debate. Well, this is what's going to finally lead to major resistance of the Americans. This Stamp Act becomes the catalyst for over the next 10 years. That's what eventually going to lead to the American Revolution. Men like Samuel Adams. You probably know him as the beer guy, but he was a Boston radical. He is the cousin of John Adams. They're not brothers, they're cousins. And he is one of the biggest leaders of this time period to advocate, resistance. We're going to resist the British. We're not going to let them just push us around. But there was both peaceful and there's violent resistance. They formed the Stamp Act Congress, 1765. 9 colonies, 9 out of the 11, sometimes referred to as the Loyal Nine, sent 27 delegates. And they began to argue and debate what exactly should we do, how should we resist, and they come up with non-importation agreements, basically what we would call a boycott. The Americans are not going to buy any British-made products, nor will they allow certain items to leave the colonies. They're going to try to hurt the British financially. And the interesting thing about this is when all of a sudden every ordinary American, from the cobbler, the shoemaker, to the housewife, to the guy who prints newspapers, to the school teacher, just ordinary average Americans now start to feel like they want to be belonging to something and begin to participate in this. All right? We're not going to have the stamp tax. We're not going to allow the British to just push us around. We're going to stop this. But there was also a violent side to this. It was a roving gang of men known as the Sons of Liberty. They were very violent men. Samuel Adams was one of their main leaders, as also a man named John Hancock. And basically these are thugs and criminals who have nothing else, who like nothing better to do than beat people up. And it becomes a very violent form of resistance. They will set fire to people's homes. They'll set fire to ships. They will tar and feather individuals. They will beat people up in the streets. They'll do whatever they can to basically bring a type of terror to British loyalists living in America to do things like to get rid of the Stamp Act or any other laws that they just didn't like. So this was the violent wing of this resistance movement that begins here in the American colonies. Okay. So one of the things that this does do is it really made England suffer financially. British merchants, for instance, were losing thousands of dollars a day by the boycott. A lot of them were afraid to do business in certain towns because of the Sons of Liberty. So they're the ones who really wind up going to Parliament, these British merchants, these men who own businesses and are dealing directly with the colonists. They're the ones who really start to complain first and begin to say, we've got to do something. We're losing too much money here. We've got to give in to the Americans some way, somehow. So by 1766, the Stamp Act is repealed. They do repeal the act. But in repealing it, Parliament also declared what they called the Declaratory Act. Basically, it stated that Parliament has a right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. What this basically means is, yes, we're going to take away this tax on you. But just so that you know, in the future, we have a right to bring up any kind of tax we ever really want to do. Kind of warning the colonists, okay, this time you won, but you're not going to win all the time. We are going to tax you no matter what. That's the Declaratory Act. But they do take away the Stamp Act. But I want to tell you a little story too. This, I don't know if you can tell, this is just what I guess you would call it a dummy. It's being hung by a tree, and you see the word tax collector. I don't know if you ever heard the expression effigy. This is what we call hurting somebody, hanging somebody in effigy. Part of what the Sons of Liberty like to do was to terrorize individuals. Now, yes, they passed the Stamp Act in 1765, but the act would not actually go into force until November 1st, 1765. So in the spring of 1765, the act is passed in Parliament in England. It takes time for all that to come to America, so they knew that they could not start enforcing this act until November 1st, 1765. So you have all these British agents that come to America, and they literally are going to have boxes and boxes of these stamps. They're going to start building tax buildings where you would go and buy and purchase these things. And one such individual in Boston was a guy by the name of Andrew Oliver. But Andrew Oliver is never going to be able to do what he's supposed to do, because the Sons of Liberty are going to scare the holy bejesus out of him. On August 14th, 1765, Oliver will wake up and hear a commotion down the street from his house. He'll open up his windows and look out, and down the street from his house, in the center of Boston, is a tree that is known as the Liberty Tree. They call it the Liberty Tree in Boston. And this is what he sees hanging from the Liberty Tree. Only it doesn't just say tax collector. It also has his name, Andrew Oliver, on it. The crowd is angry and screaming, "Death to tax collectors." What do you think Andrew Oliver is going to do? You think he's going to go, oh, well, this is just fun and games, and I'm just going to go about doing what I want to do? No, he's going to hide for his life. In fact, later the next day, they will storm his own house and pillage his house and then set it on fire. Thankfully, he wasn't there. He went and hid in a neighbor's house. Andrew Oliver will eventually secretively leave and go back to England. This is going to happen all over the colonies. On August 26, 1765, in Boston, they demolished the lieutenant governor's house because for some reason, they believed that the lieutenant governor was part of this, even though he wasn't. That's how angry people are becoming and how violent it's going to be. It is so violent, and the atmosphere living in all the various colonies becomes so tense and so anxiety-ridden that on November 1st, when this law was supposed to go into effect, you would not find one single stamp anywhere in the American colonies. Either the tax collectors sent them back to England. In some cases, they dug holes in their backyard and buried them, or disposed of them some other way. I mean, this is a very contentious time period. People living in the American colonies, there was a lot of friction, a lot of resistance, and a lot of violence, quite frankly, that scared these tax collectors. For instance, tar and feathering. This is not a fun process to go through. I think sometimes we hear, oh, tar and feathering, and we see pictures like this. Here is a British agent. He's either stripped to his underwear, or some cases maybe even stripped completely. He's dipped in tar, and then feathers are put on him. Here you can see they're also trying to drown him in tea. These are the Sons of Liberty. Now think about it. Who do you think drew this political cartoon? Do you think the Sons of Liberty drew this cartoon? Or do you think British agents drew this cartoon? I'll let you decide for yourself on that one. But you think about it. You're being put into tar. Tar has to be hot in order to make it liquid. Sometimes you might have made the tar too hot, and you could literally burn skin off. Not only that, But once it dried, how in the world are you going to take this tar off your body once it's dried?
Medic!
Yes, medic! Help! Painful. There are places on your body I'm sure you would never want tar to be, let alone dry, and then you have to peel it off. Not a fun process at all. So not only are they hanging and even setting people on fire in effigy, but they're also tar and feathering people. They're burning houses. They're destroying property. Yes, British agents in America are scared, and they don't want to have to deal with this anymore. But the British are not done. Like I said, they passed the Declaratory Act, warning the Americans that they can pass laws on them if they want, and so they're going to come up with another one known as the Townshend Act. Named after Champagne Charlie, that's his nickname, but it's Charles Townshend, controlled the British ministry. He now basically becomes, like I said, we'll call it a prime minister. And he does not like the colonies at all. He's very angry with how they reacted to the Stamp Act. And he's going to come up with a whole new series of taxes aimed specifically, in all honesty, to agitate Americans even further. The 1767 Townshend Acts, these are indirect taxes. These are ones that you normally wouldn't notice because they would not be paid in the store. Like today, if you go to wherever you're going to go and buy a pair of shoes, you know you're going to pay a 6% sales tax. That's a direct tax. You see it. You see a price of the shoes, but then you ring it up and there's 6% added to it. But the indirect tax is already built into the price of the product. Like I said earlier, a good example of that today would be gasoline. You go and you pump your car with gas. You don't all of a sudden now have to pay an extra 6%. You just ring it up and you're done, you drive away because the tax is built in. That's indirect. It's still an external tax though because it's coming from outside the colonies. It's coming directly from England. And it's on all these imported goods. It's mostly paint, glass, and tea. It's on a lot of different items and lead, by the way. It's paint, lead, glass, and tea. It's on a lot of different items that you could easily smuggle. If you think about it, the Americans protested so strongly with the Stamp Act because you can't smuggle newspapers. You can't smuggle in marriage licenses. You can't smuggle in a business contract. That's not something you can smuggle. You're going to have to pay that tax directly. So they got very violent and they burned the houses down. Now you have an indirect tax on goods like paint, lead, glass, tea. These things you can smuggle. All right? So the Americans do not react as violently to the Townshend Acts as they do to the Stamp Act. Now, the other thing that Charles wanted to make sure that Americans understood, these taxes were not to pay for the army. This new revenue was to help pay for the salaries of royal governors and of judges. And you might think to yourself, well, why is that a big deal? Well, because up until this time period, Americans paid the salaries of royal governors and Americans paid the salaries of judges. He's taken that control out of their hand. And if you think about it, whoever pays the royal governor's salary or whoever pays a judge's salary, I'm not saying, but maybe I'm saying it might be easy sometimes, to bribe a little bit, right? To get people to do things for you because your salary's coming from them. Well, now you're going to stop that. You're not going to allow Americans to pay the salaries of governors or of judges anymore. Again, he's trying purposely to antagonize Americans. He also suspends the New York legislature, their assemblies. He suspends them. They're not allowed to meet anymore and come up with their own different laws. So he takes that right away from New York. Like I said, the colonists do not react quite as passionately to these laws because, again, it's too easy to smuggle. However, Charlie wasn't done. He also is going to send 2 regiments of British soldiers that were stationed up in North Canada, in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And he's going to land those troops in Boston in 1768. And he's doing this on purpose. And it's funny because there's a famous woman, Mercy Otis Warren, who we'll talk about her in class. she's going to write in her diary that this was a day that lives in infamy. And maybe you've heard that quote before. Maybe you've heard that from when FDR talked about Pearl Harbor. But this is a very important moment, though, where these British troops are coming here. And again, I'm going to show you in just a few seconds exactly how this does antagonize the Americans. Actually, I'm going to show it to you right now. When the British come to Boston, British soldiers, they're getting paid. They're in the regular British Army, they're redcoats, right? But they always get time off as well. Sometimes you get a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks off. You're not paid for that. You don't make a lot of money being a soldier. So they wanted part-time jobs. Unfortunately, there aren't any part-time jobs in Boston. Well, until the British start to make Bostonians fire individuals so that you can hire British soldiers when they're on their off time, especially on the docks of Boston. This starts to anger Bostonians, and Charlie gets the fight that he wants. The Bostonians begin to protest. We're going to talk a lot about this in class on Wednesday. We're going to talk a lot about this particular engraving. This was engraved by a member of the Sons of Liberty. You may have heard of him. His name is Paul Revere. We're going to talk a lot about what is being shown here. These men in a line, Captain Preston in the back, and Bostonians being gunned down in a brutal, horrible massacre. Or did this scene take place slightly different? Again, those of you who are in my class, we're going to talk specifically about that on Wednesday in class. And we're going to show how this is really a propaganda drawing. This really is not how this went down. But again, to set it up, they're taking jobs away from Bostonians, and it's going to lead to a lot of anger. And eventually it does lead to this particular moment, a very sad, terrible moment in American history. Unfortunately, Townshend will not live to see it. He will die of a massive heart attack shortly before this even takes place. So he's not going to know just how much he does antagonize the Americans. But because of this particular event, they're going to have to repeal the Townshend Acts. They failed to raise really any needed money that the government needed. In fact, in 1 year, only about 295 pounds, this little sign here means pounds in with the British currency, a little less than $300 in American money was ever actually raised. And think about that. How much money it takes to actually create a law and then to enforce that law, and all you raised was a little less than $300 in one particular year. Because again, what were Americans doing in order to get their lead, paint, glass, and tea? That's right, they were smuggling. Thank you. Thank you for paying along in that one. In 1771, the Townshend Act is repealed. Right? We've had bloodshed in the streets of Boston. England they're getting worried. They really don't want this violence that's happening. However, they are going to leave a 3p toll on tea. I wonder what that's going to bring about. Interesting. In 1772, Samuel Adams organizes what's known as local committees of resistance, or I have it up here, committees of correspondence. Now this word seditious, to commit a seditious act, is treason. Right? This is treason on part of the Americans. They're being controlled by the British. They're not allowing them to have a lot of free press, for instance. A lot of their newspapers are being censored and even closed down. Well, Sam Adams first organizes a local committee of resistance within Boston to spread news. They basically, remember, information in this time period can only go as fast as a man can carry it. So you're talking about a lot of guys on horseback who are running throughout the countryside and bringing news of what's happening in Boston to all the outlying cities. It's also a way of spreading propaganda. right? You're getting people to believe and act the way you want them to. You want people to get disgusted with the British. You want more resistance against the British. So you're spreading all this gossip, rumors, and real legitimate news. In 73, Virginia gets involved. The Virginians want to have a big part of this as well. They're going to establish an intercolonial major committees of correspondence. They want all the colonies involved, not just Boston, not just Massachusetts. They want to make sure that every colony is warned. If something happens in Boston, they want to know about it in Williamsburg, Virginia. They want to know about it in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They want to know about it in New York City, right? They want to know these things. They also, the Virginians argue, this will broaden the resistance. More and more colonies will be involved, not just Massachusetts. And the reason this came about was something that happened off the coast of Rhode Island, known as the Gaspé Incident. The Gaspé is the name of a British Navy ship. All right, so it's a ship of war, and it was hunting smugglers. Throughout the French Indian War, most of your smugglers were found in Rhode Island. Remember, this is a colony of a lot of resistors, of a lot of independent thinking people who don't like to be part of the government and don't like to be told what to do. So a lot of smugglers are in Rhode Island. The Gaspé is hunting a particular ship called the Hannah. It's late night in June, and you can't really see. It's dark, it's night, and as the Gaspé is chasing this boat, it didn't realize that it had come into shallow water, and the Gaspé gets stuck on a sandbar. Now, the crew tried to free itself, but it was unable to. So it decided it would wait till high tide come in, and maybe it would just float off of this sandbar. In the meantime, in Rhode Island, groups of Sons of Liberty got on rowboats in the middle of the night and rowed out here. And they board the ship, they attack the crew, they shoot and wound the captain, and they set the boat on fire. Excuse me for that. Think about what I just said, though. A Navy ship, a ship of war, and colonists from Rhode Island set that ship on fire and shoot and wound the captain. That is an act of war, right? Virginia, a much larger colony with a larger population, does not want to be stuck all of a sudden fighting a war because some yahoos in Rhode Island started on them. So this is another reason, this is actually the major reason why Virginia started these committees of correspondence throughout the entire colony. I want to know if Sons of Liberty in Rhode Island are acting way out of control. This is a way of also keeping everybody on the same page. Let's not do violent acts like this. Let's not antagonize the British so they all of a sudden send troops everywhere. Thankfully, the British do not respond with war in 1773, but it is now very, very tense in America. And as I said, they kept the Tea Act. Yes, the Tea Act, this 3 pence or 3 penny tax on tea. However, they're going to come up with what they think is a very, very good idea. The major company is the British East India Tea Company. It's losing money. It's losing money. It's not doing as well as it had done in the past. It's a major company in Great Britain. It had a monopoly on tea, and nobody wanted to see this thing fail because especially in Parliament, a lot of members of Parliament had stock in this company. So they came up with a brilliant idea. They thought what they could do is lower, or let me see, I want to get my notes here so I say it exactly how I want to say it. That's why you're probably hearing paper shuffling. They were going to permit this company to sell the tea directly to the colony without a tax, without the middleman. So you don't have to put an extra tax on here. So this tea will be sold cheaper to the colonies than all the other teas. Here you've got your opportunity. now for Americans. You can get a cheaper tea, you can get one that's less taxed, right? Or you can pay the tax on all the other teas and show that you're loyal to the British. This seemed like a win-win to the British, right? We're going to give them cheaper tea. We're also going to help the British East India Company, and we're also going to help members of Parliament who have stock in this company. And of course, the Americans see right through this, and they get very, very angry, and we get the famous Boston Tea Party happens. They're going to come out here, some of them dressed as Mohawk Indians, as you can see up here, which is really a silly moment in history in a lot of respects, them doing this. But you were talking 342 chests of tea are going to be dumped into the Boston port. That's the equivalent today, if we did, if we adjust for inflation, about 700,000 to perhaps just under $1 million worth of tea is going to be dumped here in the harbor. That's a lot of money for them in that time period, and the British have had enough. They've had enough with the Americans. And we get the famous Intolerable Acts, or sometimes known the Coercive Acts, to coerce, to force you to do something. We have a new Prime Minister. His name is Lord North. And they're actually a series of 4 laws, 4 acts that are combined together, and the Americans called them intolerable because they couldn't tolerate them. The Boston Port Act is passed. They're going to close the port of Boston. No more trade. They're going to stop all trade coming in and out of Boston. This is going to financially ruin Boston merchants. It's also going to ruin merchants throughout the colony of Massachusetts. Massachusetts is going to be cut off from the rest of all the other colonies. They're going to pass the Government Act. They're going to abolish the charter rights that they have. They're going to instigate a military government under General Thomas Gage. He's going to establish martial law, right? The military will control all of Massachusetts. They're going to stop all town meetings. And by the way, this is how specific they got. If they saw 2 men or more stopping on a street corner and having a conversation under the Government Act, you could arrest those men for having an illegal town meeting. That's how serious the British got on this. If you had just 2 guys, what if they were talking about the weather? We're talking about, hey, John, I like your shoes. Thanks, Ted. I like your breeches. I don't know, your stockings. Your stockings are so cool. Well, you can get arrested because they think you're actually holding a town meeting. Because in all honesty, secretively, that's how the people of Boston were holding their town meetings. They actually were trying to get together 2 or 3 people to have secret little conversations within 5-10 minutes and then walk away. And the British were wise to that, so that's why they tried to stop them. A brand new Quartering Act is passed. Now, instead of just maybe put soldiers in your private homes, they're going to put soldiers in your private homes. They're going to start throwing a lot of people out of their house and putting soldiers in there. The Administration Adjustment Act. Now, I didn't go into the Boston Massacre with you. Like I said, on Wednesday, we're going to talk a lot about that. But just to give you a heads up, those soldiers who participated in the Boston Massacre in 1770, they will be arrested and they will be tried in Boston. Well, under the Administration Adjustment Act, soldiers accused of a crime, British soldiers, will never again have to be tried in an American court. They'll be sent back to England to be tried in English courts. All right, this was a huge, huge deal for the Americans. Again, they saw this as, well, you're just going to allow British soldiers basically to do whatever they want, whenever they want to do it, and there's no repercussions for this. So yeah, this is really going to anger the Americans. Now, there's this other law that gets passed at the same time, and this is on your colonial charts. Hopefully you're going to find this out. This actually is not a tax, and it's not a law that's aimed at Americans. It actually was a very good law, but in bad company. They passed it right at the same time they're passing these other laws, and it dealt specifically with Quebec. Quebec was obviously once a French colony, and there are mostly French people who still live there, but are now under control of the British. So what they did with Quebec is they allowed them to have a state religion, which was Catholicism. They allowed them to have their own assemblies and elect their own people, and they also gave them control of the Ohio River Valley. Not such a bad law, but you can see where Americans got very angry. What, Quebec is allowed to have their own assemblies? Quebec is allowed to elect their own people, their own assemblies, and New York lost their assembly. Boston, Massachusetts lost their assembly. We're not allowed to have town meetings anymore, but you can do whatever you want in Quebec. And you're going to give them the Ohio River area, all that land that Americans felt that they won in the French Indian War. Yes, this is taking kerosene and throwing fire on the kerosene and then adding gasoline. And it's just going to explode terribly in the face of the British. The Americans respond by forming what's known as the First Continental Congress. 12 colonies. Rhode Island stayed out of it. 55 delegates were sent. Famous people like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Thomas Paine, George Washington. These men will all basically meet for the first time in Philadelphia. Their agenda was how are we going to respond to these intolerable, or, like I said, the other expression, coercive acts. Also, what are we going to do about the Quebec Act? How are we going to respond to this? Even though it has nothing to do with us, but it seems completely unfair to Americans. Each colony was represented by one vote. No matter how many people you sent, you can send 3, 4, or 5 from your colony only got one vote. It's not like these guys all agreed. They all came from different colonies. They had different objectives. They had different thoughts. For instance, North Carolina, they felt like they weren't being punished at all. Why should we really care so much? It's interesting. Most of what these guys did throughout the summer of '74 was eat and drink a lot. George Washington, in his own journals, talked about he rented a house in Philadelphia and maybe spent all of 5 or 6 nights for an entire 3-month period because he was constantly visiting other people's homes and having what he said, very delicious barbecue. Barbecue was a very popular form of food at this time period, as it is in our time too, but it was extremely popular at this time period. But in the end, what they agreed to again is the boycott. They come back with the non-importation agreement, but they also start to pass certain laws that said that home colonies should start creating and manufacturing their own goods, clothing, candles, soap, for their own consumption. So not only are they going to boycott British goods, but they're going to start making and manufacturing certain items for themselves, and thereby not worry about what the British want to do as far as trade. They feel that this, again, it economically hurt during the Stamp Act in 1765. That was 9 years ago. Hopefully this will work again. Unfortunately, it's not going to. Throughout this time period, farmers have been organizing themselves into little militia bands. Farmers are doing this, right? They're organizing themselves. The most famous group I'm sure you heard of are the Minutemen, because they had a minute's notice. They can get everything ready and fight the British. And in this famous moment at Lexington and Concord, April 18th, 1775, the shot heard around the world, that literally begins the American Revolution. I'm going to talk probably a little bit more specific in class about this event. Again, it's one of those events that is greatly glorified in American history as this great myth of these great men who stood and faced this British army. And it's kind of, again, not exactly like that. The British had heard of weapons of mass destruction that were being held in Concord, gunpowder and cannon and muskets and bayonets and sabers, and General Gage sent out a column of British troops, about 300 strong, to march to Concord and to collect these weapons of mass destruction. I like how I say that word. And also to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the leaders of the Sons of Liberty. This ties into that famous midnight ride of Paul Revere. The British are coming, the British are coming. Again, that's kind of a myth as well, and in class I'll talk a little bit more about that. And supposedly, when the word got out that the British were coming, hundreds and hundreds of Minutemen were supposed to stop the British at a place called Lexington. But in actuality, only about 70 men showed up. who were mostly 19-year-old boys or 50 and 60-year-old men. And they weren't exactly the bravest guys, but they showed up. And the British show up, and it's a stare down. And to this day, no one knows exactly who fired the first shots, but somebody fired. The Minutemen fired and then ran for their lives. As they began to run, the British began to shoot at them, killing a few of them, wounding several others. Only one British soldier was nicked in the neck. He got a shot, it just barely nicked his neck, and that was it. And supposedly that's it. You know, the British have scared off these rebels, these men who are committing treason against the crown. They go on to Concord. They find absolutely nothing at Concord. So they happen to march back to Boston. And it's on the way back, marching through the woods, where now you have perhaps 1,000, 2,000. It's really hard to say how many men eventually show up and hide behind every tree, every rock, every plant, and it's guerrilla warfare. They fire at the British and then they run away. The British have to, reform themselves, keep marching in the woods, and then an hour later, another set of men are hiding in trees and rocks and firing, and the British are going to have to literally fight their way back to Boston. Close to 100 of these British soldiers are going to die. Several of them are going to be wounded, and that's it. You have spilt blood. You've spilt blood, and it's going to be now full-on war. Thomas Jefferson did not start this war. Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, none of those men were here. Farmers did it. Farmers got angry enough that they finally start this war. And the first real battle took place shortly after, in June 1775, on a place called Breed's Hill, but mistakenly to this day called Bunker's Hill. And here's this famous painting of these Minutemen, these militiamen, and the orders being given, do not fire till you see the whites of their eyes. And it's a huge hill on an island outside of the port of Boston. And the British land troops here and try to march up this hill, and the Americans have the high ground. And in the book, The Invention of Air, it talks about this moment. What the Americans lacked was gunpowder. Because they run out of gunpowder here, they have to retreat, and the British win. But the British suffered massive casualties trying to take this hill, while the Americans only suffered less than 10. If they would have had enough gunpowder, they would have won the Battle of Breed's Hill, and perhaps the outcome of the war would have been completely different. Maybe the British would never have actually fought. They would have seen the Americans would really fight to the end. But as it were, the Americans ran away, and the British will always consider them to be cowards for this. And this is going to bring an end to this particular lecture. Like I said, it did go a little longer. I told you it would, so you've got all week to watch it. I hoped you liked it.
It needs to be about 20% cooler.
About 20% cooler? Okay, next time I'll try to make it 20% cooler at least. So thank you for listening, and see you tomorrow. Well, some of you I'll see tomorrow.